One, two, three. Welcome. Dr. Stephen Hobbs here from the Wealth Movement in the third of 5 interviews with Chris Thomson. And we're exploring the inner cosmos. And we've talked about the inner cosmos from the perspective of we resemble the universe. And the second one was about the knowable universe. And what we're going to do is explore, unpack, discover insights that are linked to the inner cosmos and movement. Chris, to be able to get to that sense of movement that we'll chat about a little bit later, I remember yesterday and in our conversations over time is that you'll use the phrase, nature always answers our questions. We played with it a little bit yesterday in our interview, but can you just unpack that again and just remind us what that means?
Sure. I mean, you could say that the cosmos or the universe always answers our questions. It's just whatever you prefer. I believe that nature, the cosmos, always does answer our questions, always, 100% of the time. And it also answers our requests, okay? When we're asking for something. Again, all the time. It's just that we don't see it. But more commonly, we don't make very good questions. We don't make very good requests. And the key to understanding all this is that the universe or nature comes back to us or resonates with us at exactly the same level. So it answers our questions in the precise terms of the question. If it's a bad question, we get a bad answer. If it's an ambiguous question, we get an ambiguous answer. If the question's not clear, the answer's not clear. Okay? Likewise with the request. If you make an ambiguous request asking for something, you'll get an answer, but it'll be ambiguous. I'll say a bit more about the request later, but first of all, questions. So here's a question for you, for anyone listening to this. Will it rain tomorrow? What's the answer to that question?
Oh, my answer to that question would be, according to the weather report, I think it's going to. Intuitively, I'm going to say yes, but it'll be more like a shower. That's what I have in when I look outside right now.
The answer is always yes. The answer to that question, will it rain tomorrow, is always yes. Why? Because I didn't specify a place.
Okay.
So it's going to rain somewhere, okay? It's going to rain somewhere. Another example given, a very common example, is the king in ancient Greece goes to see the oracle the day before the battle and asks the obvious question, will the battle be won? And the oracle says yes, and the king goes away feeling happy and reassured, and guess what? He loses the battle. What is the question the king should have asked?
Will I win the battle that's going to take place today or tomorrow, whichever timeline it is for him?
The question he wanted to ask, the question the king wanted to ask but didn't ask is, will I win the battle tomorrow? Will
okay.
I win the battle tomorrow? That's the question he should have asked. Okay, so I mean, it's typically people don't ask very clear questions. And the cosmos or nature comes back with the equivalent. So it resonates by coming back at the same level. But you get the answer that's contained in the question, so to speak. Another example in science. So when physicists say, you know, is the world made of little particles? Nature says, sure, yeah, okay. And then they change the question and they say, well, is nature made of waves rather than particles? And nature says, yeah, sure. So scientists get very confused. How is it possible that the world can be made of particles and waves? And what the universe is doing is saying it all depends on the question. If you conduct an experiment designed to elicit the presence of particles, you're going to get particles in the answer. If you change the experiment and start looking for waves, you'll find waves, okay? So a lot depends on the question. And I'll say more in a minute about requests, because the same ideas apply to requests.
So for everyone to understand that, then the quality of your question, the words that are in your question are going to be of importance. So asking the question, you've got to put a little bit of effort sometimes into formulating the question to be able to get, if you're asking a question about A, to get the A response or a little bit more. Is that what you're getting at right now?
I'll give another example, okay? So a friend of mine from Canada, from Toronto, used to run workshops for companies in exotic places like Mexico. And these were to find the vision of the team. It was to create a vision for the team. And he would usually start the sessions by asking everyone a question. He would say to each one of them, what is it you really want? And one of the guys said, I want a house in Mexico. And my friend Martin said, I guarantee you won't get it. And people in the room were a bit shocked, okay? And the guy said, how do you know? He said, well, you have to specify what house in Mexico do you want? Not only that, you have to say when you want it. When do you want that house, that specific house in Mexico? But people typically don't make that kind of request. They're very loose, shall we say, with their requests. People might say, I want more money. And they won't get it. They will not get it because more money is not a request. The universe won't respond to that because it's not really a request. What do you mean by more money? Do you mean $5? Do you mean $1,000? Do you mean €6? What do you mean by you want more money? And secondly, the universe will say, when do you want it? Do you want it next year or the year after? When do you want it? You have to say what it is exactly you want. And, you know, specify exactly. And this is why people often don't get what they want. They think they know what they want. They might even put out some kind of prayer, some kind of request, okay, in the form of a prayer, for example. But because the request is not clear enough, or maybe not heartfelt enough, the universe will come back and resonate at the level of ambiguity. Is this all making sense?
Yes, yeah. Well, I think it goes back to, there's a root word in the two words, question and request, is quest. And if you're going to be on a quest, you've got to be clear about what the quest is about, and timelines and intentions and all that. I think there's a story thread there. I'm offering that.
And as you well know, all quests begin with the first step, okay? In fact, there's a supposedly Chinese proverb about that. Whether it's Chinese or not, I don't know. But all journey, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with the first step, okay? And that's important. It may seem obvious and simple, why even mention it? And yet, many people find the first step the hardest step to take. What they find is that they're somehow stuck, okay? They may be stuck mentally, they may be stuck because of some fear or lack of confidence in themselves. But for whatever reason it is, they find that first step the hardest to take. And it reminds me of the difference in physics between two kinds of friction. One is called static friction, one is called kinetic friction. Static friction is the force you need to get something moving when it's not moving, okay? So that's the initial force to get something actually moving. Once it's moving, kinetic friction is the force you need to keep it moving. And because something's already moving, you require much less effort to keep it moving. The real effort, as you can imagine, is to get it started in the first place, okay? Now that applies in physics, but it also applies in human life. The real effort for most people is to make that first step, to get into movement. But once people are in movement, wow, what a difference that makes, Steve. What a difference that makes. The difference between people being stuck in life and actually moving in life, it's a world of difference.
It is, and I appreciate going there, but let's unpack that in a second, because you mentioned the word resonance again when you were talking about the questions and the requests, and that seems to be a thread that's come through the first two interviews. It's present again here in the third. I think it would be great to just sort of tie that up a little bit and say, okay, from a resonance point of view, this notion of request, and that putting you into movement, there's got to be some storyline in there about resonance. Can you just unpack that part?
Sure. I mean, the overall theme of these interviews, as you know, is the inner cosmos. The basic idea is that we human beings, in some ways, resemble the cosmos out there, okay? And because we resemble it, we are able to resonate with it. In other words, be on the same wavelengths as it, okay? And when we get on these wavelengths, that's when things start happening. However, more often than not, we send out, shall we say, mixed wavelengths or mixed messages, okay, in the form of poorly constructed questions or requests that don't quite make sense. All right, so these are things coming out from us, like frequencies, if you like, messages, and the universe picks that up and it resonates with what comes from us. Now, if what's coming from us is very clear, very definite, 100%, the universe will get onto that frequency and resonate back to us, okay? And give us good answers. Will answer our requests. But what I'm saying is that more often than not, we give out kind of mixed, poor resonances, okay? That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, and that goes, again, with unpacking is the quality of the questions and the quality of the requests, and being very clear with what you're asking for and the kind of questions you're doing and proposing. So jumping into the world of movement then, we've got the question request, we've got the resonance, same level of answer, or a little bit more kind of idea, and into this notion of movement. Personally, I think movement is a great word because it's the name of my company, Wealth Movement. And I speak about, making a movement, making the movement, making your movement, the different elements of looking at movement. And you had said that nature answers and answers your questions, answers your requests, but also what it is now is putting that action into movement. Can you help us with that one?
I think I get where you're trying to go with this, Steve. One way of thinking of this is that movement, the idea of movement, is one of the most natural and common things in the universe. The other, and this may surprise people, the other equally common thing in the universe is order. But let's put that to one side just now and let's stay with movement, okay? So when I say that movement is common to everything, what do I mean? I'm saying that everything is in a state of movement. Everything. Even a heron by a riverbank, apparently very, very still. Inside that heron, its heart is beating, its biochemistry is active, it's breathing. There's movement inside it, okay? Quite apart from its internal movements, that heron is a part of many external movements. So this planet that the heron is standing on is turning once every 24 hours. The same planet is orbiting the sun once a year, okay? The sun itself is moving through space, quite fast in fact. The sun is part of a bigger set of movements, orbiting the center of this part of the galaxy, okay? The galaxy itself is moving, and so on, and so on, and so on. So even those things which appear to be static are internally moving and also part of many external movements. Everything's moving, Steve, not just in one movement, but in many movements. So I would, stick my neck out and feel quite confident that movement is common to everything in the universe. It's one of the most natural things there is.
But movement also down into the cellular level. I understand cells and atoms and all that are part of the universe, but there's also that quantum physics kind of storyline. Everything is moving. I agree. One of the other ones that I always use is the notion of plate tectonics, right? Is the people are always saying, I've got to find my position. I've got to find what it is. It's sort of like the sense of, I want to nail something down. And I'm going, no, you got to accept to live on moving ground, right? Because the plates are even moving on which you're standing. So movement is natural. I agree wholeheartedly with you with that. Now, I'm thinking that kinetic and static force energy that you talked about is going to influence this notion of movement, right? And linking it to the person, because people tend to, they hold themselves back from what is natural in terms of movement. So do you want to connect that static and kinetic piece to movement right now?
Sure. As you know, I'm a mountaineer. And because I live near about 10 ski stations, I've got about 10 ski stations within 1 hour of my house. So lots of skiing. And when I was younger, I taught a few people to ski, and I taught a few people to rock climb. And I noticed that in at least 50% of cases, in at least, maybe more, Steve, people would freeze. They'd become static, okay? In one case, I had to prise someone's fingers off the rock to get them to move. And I used to have to employ tricks to get people to move on the rock, because they get to a point where their mind told them, I can't move any further. And the truth is, the fact is, The safest way to be on rock climbs is in motion. It's strange but true. It doesn't sound true, it sounds counterintuitive. But the safest way to be on rock climbs is in motion. So, and the difficult thing for people learning to climb is to overcome that static friction, that stasis. But once they do, once they kind of reach up and start moving, oh, what a difference. Once they're in motion, they realize it was much easier than they thought. Likewise with skiing. I mean, skis are built to turn. They're built to curve, okay? And basically, all you have to do is let the skis do the work for you. That's the essence of good skiing. But when people are learning to ski, their inclination is to stop. Their natural tendency is to stop, is to brake because they're nervous, okay? So they're constantly in a stopping motion, if you can imagine that. When, in fact, the best thing they could do is to let themselves go down the mountain, okay? And in a way, go with the skis. Of course, eventually they learn to do that, and they laugh about the way they were when they were braking and stopping. But I think these two things, rock climbing, getting nervous about moving on the rock, and getting nervous on the steep slopes when you're skiing, it's a good example of overcoming static friction. Once you're actually moving, things really improve. The trick is to get into movement. Now, I think what I've just said about rock climbing and skiing applies to everything else. Everything else.
Yeah, I was going to go there is because, but I have to share a quick story. Is I'm 6'7" and I started to do rock climbing, and at one point in time I got myself sort of arms out, feet out, and I couldn't move anywhere. It's because I stopped moving, and then I'm just sort of against the wall going, okay, and then you claim I'm falling and just go back so that you can be taken off. But the funny thing was I was only about 7 or 8 feet up there. I understand what you're saying. I that image was always part of me. And then when I went to do it again, I knew motion was important. So I understand that experience. So when it gets into the business world, like life business, it's really about keep moving in your business. And sometimes you're not going to work. Like, I'm up against the wall, I got to fall backwards. We might call that a failure. No, it's just a learning moment in a sense. But even in business, you've got to do something similar. That's what you're hinting at here, right?
A good example is Brexit. The UK voted to leave the European Union. Scotland didn't, as it happened, but that's another matter. And businesses right now are starting to worry, get seriously worried for many reasons, but one reason is the just-in-time philosophy, which I'm sure you've heard of. And the car industry in particular relies on that in order to keep its inventory at a minimum. So everything has to be flowing neatly and nicely. But because we're leaving the European Union, there'll be customs and border checks and queues and all kinds of things, okay, which are going to really make a mess with the just-in-time. But when I think of the just-in-time model, I have this picture of things flowing nicely and smoothly and going from A to B to C and back, and things moving in a nice fashion is the vision I have of that. But businesses, when they can't do that, when they can't rely on things moving in a neat, orderly fashion, they get very worried. So movement, very important for business.
So even the sense of paperwork, you gotta get it moving. Like I sometimes chat with other entrepreneurs, and they talk about the piles of paper that I got on my desk, right? When in fact, if you got it moving, not move just to the other side of the desk, but actually getting it taken care of and moving it through the systems that you've created. That's even like a small example of what you're talking about, because it's sort of statically sitting there, but you got to kinetically get it moving, either to file it, deal with it, whatever it might be. There's that kind of connection as well.
Another example is I occasionally write books. And, you know, I used to suffer from writer's block. And writer's block is basically you can't get moving. Okay, you're back in stasis. You have to overcome that static friction. You're the equivalent of the rock climber stuck on the rock, unable to move. Okay, and you know, when I was blocked in that way, unable to write, I began thinking about my rock climbing and skiing experiences when I was young. And I thought, well, hang on, if that applies to rock climbing and skiing, it surely applies to this as well. And I got into the habit of writing longhand with a very nice fountain pen, you know, a very high quality pen. And I found that if I just went somewhere, maybe a local cafe, just went at a certain time, maybe 8 o'clock in the morning, sat down, got my coffee, got the paper in front of me, and just began writing, regardless of what I was writing. It didn't matter what I was saying, okay? But just the action of getting the pen onto the paper and making some words with the ink, it changed everything. I mean, the block disappeared immediately. As I said, just to repeat, it didn't actually matter what I was writing. The point was I was making movement, okay? I was able to escape from that static friction position and get into the kinetic position. It really worked. And I haven't had writer's block since.
And I understand that one too, is I'll take myself out, and even if it's just not writing, it's just getting some ideas out, right? And get it going and see where it takes me. So if we link this back to the inner cosmos, and we're talking about this from a life perspective, there are things that get people and they're stalled, they're stuck, and we give them all different kinds of names, right? I'm not going to get into all the different kinds of names that we give those things. One of the things that I share with people is simply going for a walk to think about and feel about what it is that's going on in your life from an inner cosmos point of view is an important element. That's an important action to take. So I give it over to you if you want to talk about those things that get us stuck from a movement life cosmos point of view and actions that deal with it. I know the listeners would be grateful to hear some ideas that you'd like to share. So what have you got up your sleeve?
I mean, it's basically the same thing. It's the same idea, okay? It's about overcoming resistance, overcoming stasis, if you like, okay? It doesn't matter what the problem is. The way to do it is just start moving. I mean, literally move. It could be any movement. You might just get up and start walking, okay? Or you might just walk and continue walking until the feeling has worn off. I mean, that's a good idea if things get really bad. But yeah, I mean, anything at all which helps you overcome the stasis. I mean, you were alluding just now to other reasons why people weren't doing things. And I guess you were thinking about fears and anxieties, which are common. I can't imagine anyone who hasn't got some fear or anxiety somewhere. I can't. You know, even those of us who've processed some of these in therapy, I'm sure there's lots of lingering stuff. But I think the same principle applies here. What I'm getting at, Steve, is there's a kind of connecting thread here, you know, a unifying principle which runs right through this, okay? And that is overcoming stasis, moving. So say you have a fear of speaking in public, for example, and many people do, it's quite common. which I did. I was morbidly afraid of being asked to stand up at school and speak, make a presentation. And eventually, not quite sure why, I became a lawyer, an attorney. Okay, and you might think, wow, this is a joke. Who is this guy? Part of the reason was because my wife and I wanted to raise our family in Scotland. So I wanted to be somehow in Scotland, okay? And being a lawyer was one way of doing that. And I realized during my training, I trained on the job. And when you train on the job, you can't appear in court until you're finally qualified. So I had 3 years of training on the job, but not able to appear on my own. I accompanied my boss from time to time and watched him. And I used to get very nervous just watching him, because I imagined me being there one day, you know. And I remember my first day, it was 1976. I was in a new company, and the company specialized in court work. So I jumped right into it. And I turned up on my first day of work, and my boss's secretary said, Mr. Jackson's not here. Has to go to Northern Ireland today on business. Would you go to court for him? I'd never been to court in my life on my own. And it was a serious case. It was a jury trial. Serious assault with a knife, okay? And as I drove to the court in another town in Scotland, my heart was thumping. I could feel everything in my life was coming together in this horrendous moment. And I somehow managed to get into my gown, my lawyer's gown, into the court, presented myself, managed to give my name. I met the client. We discussed everything beforehand. And at the last minute, and the jury were sworn in, okay? It was a full jury trial. And at the last minute, the judge said, oh, I think your client wants to talk to you, because I was in front of him. And he was behind me in the dock. And so I turned around, he said, I've changed my plea, Mr. Thomson. I'm going to plead guilty. But I was let off the hook at the very last minute, you know. But the point of my story is, I think something inside me, maybe unconscious, made me become a lawyer, because I knew I had, at some point in my life, to overcome this morbid fear. Otherwise, I'd never make any progress in life, you know. If I was stuck behind the fear all my life, life wouldn't be worth living. And, you know, it wasn't easy at first, but I persisted. I kept turning up in court. I kept speaking in public. And eventually I got to the point of actually liking it. My fear had somehow gone away completely. And I think the reason for that, Steve, is because I had walked into my fear, okay? So I had a fear of speaking in public, okay? What's the best thing, the best way of conquering that fear? Answer, go and speak in public. You've got a fear of heights. Best way to conquer that? Take up rock climbing, and so on. Doesn't matter what your fear is. Doesn't matter what your fear is. That fear will suggest the activity you need to do. And it works. I mean, I've talked to people about this, and it works. So it's just an example of moving. So in this case, you're moving into your fear. And gradually the fear just dissolves and disappears because you've moved into it.
So it's walking into it to get the movement, because movement is natural. If I'm connecting a couple of thoughts that you've shared. And I like that sense of movement is natural. It makes for a great image. And I won't go so far as to say, whoa, there's a tagline for marketing, but there is an element of real elemental truth to that statement, which I think is really quite beautiful. So I think with today, we're getting close to our 37 minutes and an out kind of idea with the interview. Is there any last little piece of advice that you'd like to give to round out the minute that's left here? I turn it over to you before we close out.
Yeah, I would just say it works. This works. I mean, this definitely works. No doubt about it. Doesn't matter what your fear is, what your anxiety is. Go and do it. Face it and walk right into it. Doesn't it? You'll feel bad. You will feel the fear. The feeling won't change. All right. But to overcome that feeling, you have to go right into the source of the fear. Likewise, if you can't move, if you're blocked, if you're unable to set out on your quest, to use your language, the best thing to do is just move. Actually get into motion, get up, start walking, move, okay? And here's the thing, we think of a quest as being a journey in a certain direction to get something particular. The first movement doesn't really matter. You can go in any direction. Your quest might be in the east, for example. But your first movement doesn't have to be a movement towards the east. Your first movement can just be getting up and moving around. This is a slight metaphor, okay? It might not actually mean getting up and just moving around. The point I want to make is that people say a journey of 1,000 miles begins with the first step. I would change that a bit. I would say the journey of 1,000 miles begins with movement.
Okay. And that movement goes to the pen to paper for writing, speaking in front of other people. Sure. That's what the storyline is here. Sure. So with that, Chris, thank you very much for today. And some of the key words, I ask people to certainly listen to it again, pull out some of the ideas that are going to make sense for you, because really it is what is natural is movement and resonance and finding out more about your inner cosmos. So with that, Chris, thank you. Take care, and we'll catch you for the next interview when it comes around.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.